Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. This is our 7th week now on the Liberating Cinema film series for 2021. And I'm grateful really to present a subject which I've been kind of fascinated for some time. And never really, this is the first opportunity I have to kind of share it with you and have someone who's really an expert come to share with us also, his expertise and also knowledge about this film and this period and Hungarian cinema more generally. Now, what the subject in question is, as we've called it in Liberating Cinema, Working Together, the Cinema of Judit Ember. And I hope you had a chance to watch today's film. It will be still available afterwards. I'm really grateful to our colleagues at the Hungarian Film Archive in Budapest, particularly Tamara Nagy and Katalin Slavko for making this film available. So we can show it to you, and with English subtitles especially. I mean, it's a rare copy to find, and it's a great work, real masterpiece. So I hope you have a chance to watch it, whether you're before or after this. But without really further ado, I'm really happy to present here our guest for tonight, Pál Czirják. He's a film historian and archivist who works at the Hungarian National Film Archive. I'll let him introduce himself. He will talk to us about Judit Ember's work, about this film, about Hungarian cinema. And then if you're patient with us, then we'll have questions as we go on. We'll have a Q&A where you can ask him questions, or you can send them to me also if you wish through the chat, and I'll relay them to him. But I hope and think it will be a very nice conversation tonight. Thank you. Please, Mr. Czirják, Pál, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here, and it's a pleasure to join such a beautiful and interesting program of archival films. So thank you very much for having me. I have written some thoughts on the historical background of the film in my essay. At this time, I should focus on the film historical context. So I at first should give you some points on the studio in which this film was made. This studio, the Balázs Studio, was initiated in 1959 by then young filmmakers such as Miklós Jancsó, and it took 2 years till the political decision makers tried to establish the studio and start to bring them some budget. Well, so the studio became a real production company in 1961, and at first it's a very unique institution in the whole Eastern Bloc, because it's a studio that was paid by the government, and the artists made huge critics on the government. So it's a bit something like a paradoxical mechanism. At its first decade of production, the studio gave the opportunity for the young filmmakers freshly came out from the film school, and in the 70s it started to open its circles to other outsiders, so-called outsiders, non-filmmakers, but underground or neo-avant-garde artists. In the turn of the 60s to the 70s, there was a huge movement of documentarists. It rooted in the education of young filmmakers, because there was a certain group of young filmmakers who turned to everyday social problems and started to experiment with the forms of documentaries. It's also an interesting question that how could a studio like the Balázs Studio manage their operating in such political circumstances? Because on the one hand, as I mentioned before, the artists of the studio opened critical questioning of the system of the political regime. Not every film, but many of the films, especially from 1968 and so on. So many documentaries, especially documentary films, short films, and feature-length films, rose serious questions about the method of the political system, the aspects of people's everyday life. On the other hand, the political decision makers or the cultural policymakers made this studio on the one hand for 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 some kind of experiment with artists and form artists and to form artists loyal to the system, and on the other hand they could control the critical aspects of the art in itself. As later turned out, some member of the studio were also secret agents of the political system. They wrote reports on the fellow members of the studio. It's always a very difficult ethical questioning, and it is the question of personal circumstances that somebody joined to some secret activities and political activities for the Communist Party. On the other hand, criticize the party's politics. But later we somehow learned that the operating of the studio was able because of this system. And on the other hand, artists not who not collaborated with this way with the political power in this way, they were also had to be tricky. For example, in this particular film, at the start, the filmmakers also, I think, they also didn't know how critic would be this film. At the in the beginning, they just started the project, and later they realized that this particular documented sessions will show the whole system in operating, and on the other hand, the political decision makers at the beginning they also suffered the project to show that they allow the critics against the system because critics always necessary to improve or repair the system. And on the other hand, the studio's other works also play a role of showing the opening, political opening for the Western world, because in many cases the films of the studio, the Balázs Béla Studio, haven't shown in Hungarian cinemas, but were shown in international film festivals instead. And in this way, with these films, with these artworks, the Hungarian cultural political power could show that in Hungary everybody can raise his or her critics, and it's some kind of artistic freedom in Hungary. So these kind of films, be it documentary or be it an experimental cinema, or be it a short feature film, showed that in Hungary artists enjoy a relatively free space to create. In the case of the resolution, the censors made another decision because they realized that the film went too far with its critics. But on the other hand, the film was banned for the public for almost 2 decades. But on the other hand, inner party members and the inner education system of the party, of the Communist Party, uh, used this film to its members to educate them how not to act in public, because the film documented so strongly the wrong movements and the wrong gestures of the power that party members at that time also realized its potential to educate themselves. So it was also a tricky and controversial situation with this film. After this film, the two directors, Judit Ember and Gyula Gazdag, went two different ways. Judit Ember stayed with this kind of filmmaking. She made several documentaries, feature-length films on very heavy political issues, and her works were also banned for years or decades later. Gyula Gazdag went to the feature film industry, if I can put it this way. So he directed several features, and he also makes some directing in theaters. He also made some feature-length documentaries in the 80s, but those films were not so critical with the system, so they got some audience in the time of their production. Well, I think we can move to the Q&A section. So if I can answer your questions, I will be happy.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is wonderful. I mean, talk and generally a great introduction to people who haven't, encountered the work of Judit Ember or before, or yes. And I think basically one of the things that fascinated me about what you said, I should say this first, that what you mentioned about your essay, I should have said also before. Yes, your essay, so Pál Csiryák's essay, his new essay on the film határozat, The Resolution, will be published through our film journal this week, so it will be available. And I recommend you check it out, especially if you watch the film, because it really appeals and unveils some aspects of the film that you don't notice or you don't know. So it's a really fascinating work. But one of the things I really like from your essay, and I highlighted in kind of the run-up to today, is the way you say the resolution's dramaturgy evokes the arc of classical dramas, in which the Calvary of the president whose attempted removal turns into an archetypal story of the fall of the good. And I think that's fascinating in terms of what it has to say about the kind of connecting to the legal and moral and ethical kind of drama that takes place throughout the film, and the unfolding of the kind of systematic contradictions of political power. So I'm very grateful that you shared this with us. I would ask you, I have kind of two questions before I open up for everyone else. One is, what is really for you kind of the significance of these directors? I mean, Judit Ember's work, because you mentioned her work, and I'm just kind of interested in the context of Hungary or world cinema, kind of rediscovering her work, and also, of course, of her fellow director who made the film with her. Why do you find it important? How can we, learn more about her? What's her significance in the context of film history? And for us viewers.
I think Judit Ember was a wonderful person. Unfortunately, I had no opportunity to meet her in person, but when you watch her movies, the first thing to just stands out is that her special connection to the people who she interviewed. So Judit Ember has a very special sensitivity for the people's inner dramas, inner conflicts, and not just people, but small communities. I think her other very important film is titled Pócs Petri. Pócs Petri is a small village uh, in eastern Hungary, and in Pócs Petri was the first show trial in 1948. It was way before the famous political show trials of the late 40s or early 50s in Hungary that the then Hungarian Communist Party made with the active help of Soviet comrades. It was the first attempt to experiment with the social system for the communists. And the story of this film is it was made, I think, in the late 70s and the beginning of the 80s. So people look back from a some decade perspective, and the film is some kind of reenact and to give some rights to the people of this village, of this small community, to show their point of view, because in 1948 there was some kind of protesting against communists who took power of the education. So the people of this village made some protest against the communists there, and there was a single gunshot in which a policeman died. And after this, the Communist Party ran off the village, and just for some weeks, the village was punished in a very harsh way, and people died and felt injuries. This village got this kind of negative image of the public, and Ember Judit was a person who gave it a try to understand what was happened in reality, and try to solve some truth to the victims of this show trial. So yes, this film Pócs Petri is also a 100 minutes or longer film, and it has also some kind of dramatic structure. But as I mentioned, the whole point of this film is the connection in which the director interviews the people, and it's a very beautiful piece. So I just recommend it to all of you. And the other important works of her are documentaries about the political turn in 19 took place in 1989. Judit Ember was made a documentary, a long documentary on the victims of the 1956 revolution. This film had some very important role for our political changes. Gyula Gazdag was also a very interesting personality, he is a very interesting personality, and his films show some effects of the Czechoslovakian new wave. So here in Hungary, there are very few directors who attempted to adopt the Czechish new wave to the Hungarian cinema, and Gyula Gazdag is one of them.
Wonderful, Paul. I think that was a very kind of detailed and revealing, well, insightful, very insightful answer, and much more than even I expected, but wonderful. I really think, yeah, I'm grateful that you share so much with us about their work. I mean, one thing that I really like that you said about Ember's work is that you said the way she portrays and brings out inner human dramas, and this work with the people, small communities, giving a voice to those who don't have one, and doing this in such a humble and dignified and moving way. I think what is really unique about this film, and like you said, the other film, Preceded, I would recommend everyone to find and watch as well. I think the Hungarian Film Archive also will speak about, I mean, making it available, but I think also it's available through the Hungarian Film Archive. And it's, I think, another exceptional film that we can talk about.
Thank you so much for this very interesting seminar. It's a great pleasure to be present for this. And I just wondered if about the essay that you mentioned that is going to be published, how can it be accessed? The essay on resolution.
Thank you very much. Great question. I will just say that we're going to publish it this week. It will be through our film journal. So through, I will send all the details, and you can also go on liberatingcinema.org.uk, and then you'll be able to find it under our film journal page later this week. So we'll be on there. But it's an original essay Pál wrote for us, and I'm kind of grateful that we can publish it, because this film, as I've said before, I found it very hard myself to find work written about it, especially in feature form. So I'm glad that we can do this. Thank you for joining us. I realize you're an expert in Hungarian cinema, and you've done a lot of work, so we're grateful to have you here with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for organizing this. And I'll look forward to reading the essay too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pál, please care to respond, or you can. I have another question for you, but I wanted to ask you just if you can maybe share with us now more broadly your work at the Hungarian Film Archive, the kind of work you do and the kind of work you're doing on restoring films and kind of really the future of film restoration, but also kind of bringing out Hungarian cinema, both nationally but also internationally. It would just be nice to kind of, from someone who's an insider in the archive as well as a film historian, it'd be nice to hear something perhaps on that.
Oh, thank you. It's very good question or forest of questions. Well, my main field is the feature films of the Kádár era. I focused on the feature-length movies, but on the other hand, the main focus of the archive nowadays is restoring and digitizing the old copies. And unfortunately, in that workflow, I have no role. So I see what my colleagues works on, and it's very interesting. Every time I discuss certain questions of the ethics of digitizing and restore digital, so-called digital restoring of films. Well, I rather be in that side of film historians who would like to show films in their original forms. So I'm not a huge fan of digitizing, or at least not a huge fan of digital restoring in such a perfect way as some other colleagues may like. We have a huge amount of original copies in negatives and original camera negatives. We systematically watch it from title to title and decide which copies will be the finest to the base of a digital restoration. We also have a huge department of marketing restored goods. So it's also very important to reach our potential viewers. And nowadays people tend not to have physical copies like DVDs or Blu-ray discs. So people just watch movies on VOD platforms till 2017, I guess we also had a movie theater. The archive had a special movie in Budapest in which we shown our treasures, but now it seems in Hungary there is no demand of this form of showing archival works. I'm a bit depressed of this because of this state. But on the other hand, the archive tried to reconnect to the network of international film archives, so it's a good thing to. We also will have an international conference next year in April in Budapest, so we are waiting it.
Thank you very much, Pál. I think I agree with you. I think one thing that you said is very wise, is this kind of change of basically, well, from analog to digital. And I think it is also presents a, there's advantages, but it's also a serious problem because of access and because of, film being kept on film. So I think in terms of basically, yes, I would also prefer, I'm in Edinburgh, and there's very now few facilities that show 35mm. And when I was organizing one of our series a few years ago, I tried to show a 35mm copy of a Tarkovsky film, which you rarely, also happens, at least in our own context, and it was very difficult to find anywhere that had even a facility. So I'm very much for also kind of diversifying and kind of opening up facilities that don't use 35mm, but also understand the nature that we need to adapt in the circumstances. So I'm glad we can show this film to people, and that the film archive provided it for us, that people can watch it. So this is, I think, a good first step. But please, what you've said about the conference, I think it's fascinating, and I think I would love to hear more, and of course about your work and about the work of your colleagues, what you're doing. So for everyone else, because we are reaching the end, I would say I think I would encourage everyone to watch this film, to watch Judit Ember's and Gazdag's other films, and then yes, to see really and experience the rich kind of tradition of Hungarian cinema that dates back to the beginning of film and is still as relevant and as strong today. So I think this is something, and to look beyond, what is initially presented, and to find really films that speak to the soul, the films that really are important, like this one that we presented here. So it's a joy also to have someone who's a film historian and an archivist talk to us. I wanted to share something, perhaps this is my own kind of interest, but I think there's a good point of comparison to be made between this film, The Resolution, and some of the films in the Yugoslav context. In the case, for example, there's a great film by Branko Bauer called Face to Face, which was often called one of the first openly political films in Yugoslavia, and that directly influenced the rise of the new Yugoslav film. So, and that also has a similar, well, I wouldn't say similar, but just thematically, it has an aspect of where it's about a workers' meeting, and this idea, basically it's mapped out this notion of self-management and workers talking about it. And another great film is by Purisha Georgievich, Pavel Pavlovich from the 70s. So I think making these connections is interesting, because when I watched these films, they very much connected with The Resolution, but something particularly poetic and beautiful remains in The Resolution that's unlike anything I've ever seen. So I'm grateful to what you presented here today, and I'm grateful that people can watch the film. Thank you.